I know some of you have wondered about my recent trip to Saipan, so just going to say a few words about it. Um, a friend of ours, Jim Ellis, has spent several decades actually doing linguistic studies and translation work for a group of islands in the Pacific, kind of northeast of Papua New Guinea. The Carolinian Islands, part of the Micronesian island complex. And the result is that a translation of the New Testament into Saipan Carolinian, also known as Rufalawash, and I'm probably not pronouncing that very well, but anyway, it's the language that is used in many of these islands down there. And so this translation then was nearly completed in the last decade, I would say, except for one final check which needed to be done. And this was being done in large part by a fellow named Jess Ilamito, who at that time was finding it difficult to work at a computer screen. So he did this final check of the New Testament while making all of his notes with pencil and paper. And so then the plan was to have these notes moved into a digital file on a computer. And what happened then was that, among other things, another typhoon hit the area. And all the original notes on paper, as well as the digital file that had been created, all got destroyed or ended up missing, and no one could find these notes. So this decades-long project then came to a slow halt, if you will. It just lost momentum. So now it was Jim's hope that maybe one more trip to Saipan, where much of this work had been done, would maybe enable him to get a team of volunteers together that would take this project over the finish line, so to speak. And one additional hope of Jim's was that he could resolve a rising concern that the translation which had been done in a language which was the traditional language of these islands, but this language had evolved over recent generations such that younger people would find it difficult to read and understand such a translation. So Jim was going to have to try to resolve this concern that maybe the translation that had been done would be difficult for current generation to read and understand. For example, even their word for God had changed over recent decades. And so many felt that the translation should be done in a more modern form of this language. Well, then what about the many years of work that had already produced a translation using a more traditional form of the language? Yet now it had become apparent that a more modern translation was needed. Only the Lord knew how to solve this dilemma. Now, in recent years, Jim was then facing an additional challenge. He had acquired let's just call it a 1 in 10 million genetic quirk that was causing him to lose function of his legs, such that it was not difficult for Jim to maneuver, and especially difficult for Jim to travel. Well, the good news was that Jim and Karina's oldest son, Jonas, would be able to take 2 weeks off work and help Jim with mobility on this trip. However, Jim was certain that he would need more than 2 weeks to complete the task, and so Jim gave me a call, and thus I joined the team, if you will, and the three of us then made plans to go to Saipan, knowing that I could help Jim after Jonas would have to return to Sweden to go back to work. And actually, 3 to 4 weeks on a lush tropical island in the Pacific sounded pretty interesting, so we made plans. What we didn't make plans for was a super typhoon called Sinlaku. In mid-April, shortly before we were going to arrive there, a storm was brewing in that region, and that storm, known as Sinlaku, had arrived on Saipan just a few days before we were scheduled to arrive. A super typhoon called Sinlaku, and this one was a really bad typhoon because it didn't just pass through, it stopped, it slowed down on Saipan and did tremendous damage. So when you fly to Saipan, the airlines will take you first to Guam, and then from Guam you'll take an additional flight, a 45-minute flight to get up to Saipan. So there we were, we arrived in Guam, and but the enormity of this typhoon had so devastated the island of Saipan that a variety of relief agencies were now trying to get to Saipan all at the same time that we were scheduled to arrive on Saipan. So what the airline did was they just began bumping our seats and giving them to relief personnel. And, you know, we understood all that. But then we had to stay in Guam for a few more days, actually for 4 more days, before we could finally get on a flight to Saipan. So what was going to happen? We hadn't planned on Sinlaku. We arrived on Saipan April 21st, and we were scheduled to be there till May 11th. Now, would this leave us enough time then to put a translation team together? And furthermore, would Jim be able to solve this dilemma of now having to put together a new team to do a modern language translation? Well, in our drive from the airport on Saipan, we saw devastation that left us wondering if the whole trip maybe was just a wasted effort. People had no power, no air conditioning, no water in their homes. Many of their homes had maybe a roof missing or significant water damage. And how could we possibly expect these people in the midst of this circumstance to not direct their attention to Bible translation? We were in a rental car, probably the last one available on the island, I think, and we had an apartment reserved for the month for us, and it had a diesel generator which would run for a few hours every morning and every evening. So we had to move forward and see what the Lord would do with this hope that we had in the midst of now chaotic circumstances. The same day that we arrived, Jim was eager to go and see some old friends, Manny and Angie, whose house had a concrete roof and was actually not severely damaged by the typhoon. Now, Angie had done so much of the work on the original translation using the traditional language. Yet now there was pressure, of course, to do a more modern translation. Well, much to Jim's surprise, it was Angie's suggestion that he consider a second translation into this more modern form of their language. And to do this in addition to the translation on which she had worked for so many years. Then the next day, we went to see a man named Jess Ilamito, who had also worked on the original translation. Jess had studied linguistics at the University of Hawaii, which is where Jim got his PhD in linguistics. And so Jess had been working for quite a long time on this original translation, only to have it lost, as I explained earlier. But Jess also then seemed in favor of somehow starting a second translation, even as the original one still needed a bit of work to bring it to completion. Jess, there with several members of his family, were now living in a rented apartment due to the fact that their houses were severely damaged by Sinlaku. So the situation is that our available time on Saipan had been decreased, while the task had increased to now including the need to do 2 translations, to complete the one that had been started and to start a new one. And of course, this was going to require 2 separate translation teams. And all of this had to be accomplished on Saipan, where there wasn't a single traffic light in operation, and people living in temporary shelters, and long lines at gas stations, and the shelves were emptying at the grocery stores. It was chaos. And how could all this happen in the midst of this chaotic scene? There was another man who had worked on the original translation named Joe Lemus. Joe died a few years ago, but the following day then we went by his house to see if we could find some members of his family. Actually, the family had 2 houses, one right next door to Joe's, and both of these houses were, like so many others, without water and power. And there we found Orlando, Joe's son. And Orlando lived next door in the other house, and his roof had been blown off. Furniture was all damaged. And so now the whole family was crowded into Joe's original house there, which had this concrete roof and was in pretty good shape. And the family members, they were all busy clearing away debris, and after a short conversation then with Orlando, Jim learned that Orlando would like to be part of the translation effort as well. So now we had been on Saipan for a few days, and on Sunday afternoon we were able to find the home of another man named Frank Rabalaman, who oversees several departments in the local government. Jim had known Frank from previous years of living on Saipan and knew that Frank also desired to see this translation work go forward. Well, working under Frank are other people whose job it is to translate, for example, government regulations into Saipan Carolinian. So the next thing we knew, Frank had organized a luncheon meeting at a local restaurant where he brought 4 more people along who were willing and able to be on this modern translation team. So within just a few days, a team of 6 people had assembled to take on the task of creating this modern Bible translation. And yet some more work would still need to be completed on that traditional translation project. Well, an old friend of Jim's, a fellow named Carlos, came to mind, and soon Jim was able to find Carlos as well. We went up to Carlos' house and began visiting with him. Again, no air conditioning, no lights, no power, no water. In a rough situation, but Carlos said, yes, he said, I'd be willing to work on completing that original traditional language translation. By this time, Jonas had to start his return journey back to Sweden. But before he left, he was a huge help in getting 2 pieces of translation software up and running on about 3 computers, which we had there in the apartment where we were staying. So from that point forward, we had people coming to our apartment nearly every night, and they would work until the generator turned off at 11 p.m., and during this time, we got software loaded onto more computers, and we got more people trained on the use of this software, which enables multiple translation workers to collaborate with each other in sort of almost real time, as well as collaborate with Jim once he returns to Sweden where he lives. So it seems like the Lord had his hand in all this. We worried that Sinlock may have ruined any chance we had to revive the translation project during this 3-week stay. And I know that many of you prayed for us on this trip, and I'd say that the Lord responded in surprising ways to these prayers. The people on Saipan are still recovering, of course, and they're rebuilding their homes and surroundings after Sinlaku. But at this point, the course has clearly been set. We have people that are involved in these two translation projects, and once again, they are well underway.